Max, welcome. This is the sort of third of these sort of weird experiments where we try and do sort of an online graduate course with this kind of pseudo interview format. So on Tuesday, I told everyone about your paper, which is very strange, a very strange thing to do. And today we're going to talk about it. And the structure is going to roughly be first, you and I are going to talk for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes. Then we'll have a little break. And then I'll sort of shift into sort of more of a chair thing and people will start throwing questions at you. So basically, yeah, that's how it will work.
That sounds good. Let's do it.
Cool. Okay, so it's nice to sort of get some context. So a question that people always ask me is like, how the hell did you end up working on this? So what was it about the sort of paleosciences or geosciences or historical sciences that kind of led you to start being a philosopher who thinks about those things?
Yeah, so it happened totally by accident for me. I started off as a graduate student, as a PhD student in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior at the University of Minnesota, working with someone who does sort of like evolution of social learning, things like that. And I got in the habit of spending my Friday mornings over at the Center for Philosophy of Science, which is something that is sort of unique at Minnesota. We have this independent Center for Philosophy of Science, and people from the at least the ecology and evolutionary biology world actually go over, which entails going from St. Paul to Minneapolis to a whole different campus to do reading groups and go to talks and things on Fridays. So I really quickly got kind of folded into that, and I thought, oh, this is neat. Not thinking I was going to ever like do it. But the more time that I spent around these people and the more time that I spent around Alan Love, I decided that I sort of needed to go over there. And I guess the thing that got me going on the sort of paleo side of things is that when I was in the Department of Evolution working on evolutionary biology, I got really interested in some of these older debates about sort of foundations of evolutionary theory, and I was really interested in Stephen Jay Gould in particular. So I went to a workshop, one of those MBL ASU History and Philosophy of Science workshops at Woods Hole in 2015 on Stephen Jay Gould, and started doing more reading in sort of the history of paleontology and thinking about what was going on in the 70s and 80s in paleontology in connection with Gould's work and these different debates that Gould was engaging in with other evolutionary biologists and other paleontologists. And it kind of grew out of that. I was looking for a dissertation topic. I was thinking, what do I know? What am I good at? What do I have some grounding in? And the Gould stuff was just sort of right there. And I didn't end up doing anything with Gould. There's a whole like cottage industry of people working on Gould or Gouldy type stuff in philosophy of historical science. I didn't really do any of that, but Gould was sort of like the gateway drug for me. And then I discovered Adrian stuff, and I thought, oh, cool! Like, look, people are doing this. I could do this too.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that more or less explicitly, sort of 5 or 6 years ago, a lot of the aim of the stuff I was publishing was very much to sort of go, I don't know if this is any good, but hopefully it'll create a space where other people can do that stuff. So it's actually really helpful to hear because, yeah, so, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, like myself and Derek Turner and Joyce Havstad and Leonard Finkelman sort of started this blog and things like this. It was a very explicit strategy to try and create a space where people might be able to do work in this area. And so of course it's sort of music to my ears to hear that at least some proportion of people have sort of found it helpful to be able to draw on that. So the paper itself, like I guess obviously we've all read it and everyone's heard me attempt to explain it, but like maybe it'd be interesting to take your what's the sort of story of the paper, like how did you come to write it, and maybe what do you think's the most important thing about it for you, like what do you think's the sort of big lesson for it?
Yeah, so the paper kind of grew out of general themes that I was thinking about for my dissertation. So this is like a teachable moment for graduate students out there. So I was really like banging my head against the table thinking, what is my dissertation about? What are the general themes of my dissertation going to be? And it took forever to figure kind of, even get in the right territory of, finding something sort of thematically coherent. But I asked Sam Fletcher, who was a philosopher of physics in our department, about this. I'm having a really hard time thinking of themes for my dissertation. Like, what do I do? And he's like, oh, it's really easy. There's this easy solution to this. Don't have any broad themes for your dissertation, which I actually think is great advice that I can impart to you. Anyways, this grew out of me trying to like figure out what a dissertation that would all hang together would be about. And I didn't write that dissertation. I just wrote this chapter. And so I was asking myself, like, what can I do? What kind of intervention can I make in this philosophy of historical science space? And I started thinking about kind of the things that people in more practice-oriented philosophy of science tend to say. I was thinking about what kinds of preconceptions do we bring to the table that I could push back on? And if you're familiar with this at all, kind of early on in this more practice-oriented movement, a lot of people were pointing out the sort of theory bias of traditional philosophy of science, you know, the theory T and evidence E type philosophy of science, right? And I was thinking, okay, that seems kind of old hat. Like, I wonder if there's something but like similar that we kind of imported from older discussions of philosophy of science into our, you know, more practice-oriented philosophy of science that I can highlight as, you know, being sort of existing presuppositions that can be undermined. And I started thinking a lot about explanation. And it seems like one of the things that happened in the sort of more practice-oriented philosophy of science is people adopted a much more liberal notion of explanation than had been current in, say, like the 1960s, where you have the covering law model, and that's kind of not the only game in town, but it's like, you know, the big thing structuring discussions of explanation. That's no longer really the case, right? People think about explanation in tons of different ways. And I think one of the kind of upshots of that has been that we tend to think a lot about explanation as being like the sort of overarching goal of science, because we have a very liberal notion of explanation that makes that into a sort of plausible thing to say. And I don't want to say that that's necessarily wrong, but one of the things that I started thinking about, again, is sort of like a theme for my work is this tendency to focus on explanation causing us to miss certain things about scientific practice? And could we, you know, what could we get out of focusing more explicitly on characterizational work, descriptive work, and then asking how that informs, influences, constrains, whatever, projects of explanatory model building, or, you know, would-be explanatory theories, things like that. So that's kind of the general intellectual background. I was thinking about all that stuff as a dissertation framing device, and I ended up writing this paper. It came together really fast for me, which is totally rare. I think my papers are usually like, they have to bake for a long time before I feel comfortable with them. I just kind of sat down and started writing this. I had the idea of sort of talking about some of Adrian's stuff, because I knew I was going to have to deal with your stuff, Adrian, at some point. Like, people are going to wonder what I'm doing if I don't have a chapter engaging with Adrian Currie in some way. So I thought, okay, like, kind of see how this all fits together. And I had some points that I wanted to make about the importance of descriptive research in these sort of prominent investigative explanatory projects in geohistory. So I think the thing that I think is important about this paper, most important about this paper, is sort of providing a richer kind of vocabulary for thinking about what I call the dynamics of explanation, sort of providing, I mean, it's not a terribly sophisticated vocabulary by any means, but just providing kind of conceptual resources for being able to ask questions like, how do these characterizational strands of research influence attempts to build explanatory models for complex events, things like that? Not, I mean, it's sort of I don't know, sort of obvious question to ask, but I think having the categories in mind and having them kind of out there enables you to play around in this space a bit in a way that is not as easy. I think these questions aren't as easy to formulate if you're thinking about, for example, the sort of testing of explanatory hypotheses as being what research in this area is mostly about. Like, you can get there. I think it's just a little bit harder. So I'm kind of trying to just give a different sort of set of categories, a different perspective that opens up this space and lets you interrogate the sort of role and value of characterizational work for these long-running investigative projects.
Yeah, no, that's really it's really helpful. Like I really like the dynamics of explanation, kind of framing an idea, and I think I think as you know I've sort of used it in a few sort of more recent pieces, and I think what for me makes it really useful, maybe one way of putting it is this, the way that I like characterizing this philosophy of science and practice stuff is something like you don't care so much about the sort of products of science, you care more about the processes that lead to those sort of products. And, so what might that look like when you're thinking about explanation? Well, you don't want to think about the explanation as a completed product. Rather, you want to think about the explanation as something which is kind of developing. And that was what I sort of, in some sense, had in the back of my mind. I like to think when I was writing those sort of earlier papers. And what's great is that this notion that you managed to sort of get at something which I think I hadn't really articulated yet, if that makes sense, just so well. And it's incredibly useful to sort of go, right, so what we're interested in is not just how do explanations change over time, but why? What kind of forces do we have changing them? That's really great. The other one that I think really deserves a lot more reflection on is this, the sort of really central move I take it you make is this distinction between sort of descriptive versus explanatory hypotheses. And something I found kind of interestingly annoying about the paper, and this often happens, like if those of you have had people write about your own work, there's this thing in which you're like, that's not really what I meant to say, and then you're like, but that is what I say. And so I found it really, really interesting the way that the papers really managed to convince me that actually there are ways in which I've been way overemphasizing the role of these sort of explanatory hypotheses. So the way that I like sort of characterizing it is something like, there's one thing that the Adrian view and the Max view kind of align on, which is something like, I think let's use the word ultimate reason for these complex explanations is because of the complexity of the phenomena, right? So that's kind of something I explicitly say and you sort of cash out. But the real disagreement is whether or not we get to that complexity by testing hypotheses that are supposed to explain phenomena, or by testing these more descriptive hypotheses, right? And so that's where I see the kind of the real difference between those sort of two views. And I think that's sort of really interesting when you put it framed in terms of those sort of dynamics. But I suppose and then there's a bunch of ways that you might try and beat up that distinction, right? And so I'll give you an example of a distinction that looks really similar to the descriptive hypotheses versus explanatory hypotheses that I don't like. And we'll see if you agree. And, so there's a common distinction in the philosophy of history between chronologies and histories, where a chronology is basically just what happened in what order. And a history lays a sort of narrative structure over the top of it. It kind of goes, that bit's important because of this bit, right? And a lot of the philosophy of history, particularly in the linguistic turn, kind of turns on people sort of showing that, using that distinction to sort of show that, for instance, narratives or like historical narratives are not really sensitive to empirical details in quite the same way that a chronology is. And I really dislike this distinction because I think that chronologies and histories are kind of co-created. That the way that when you're a historian and you're going into the archives, you have a kind of narrative in mind and what you find, and that partly shapes what you find, and then what you find shapes that narrative, right? And so the idea that I can sort of think that there's a chronology and then there's a narrative and then there's a history is to really mistake the way that these things go together, right? And so I tend to be very suspicious of that distinction as it's sometimes used in the philosophy of history. And hopefully you can see that looks similar to the kind of distinction you're making between these two types of hypotheses. And I wonder if you think there might be ways of putting pressure on it in a similar way.
I think I'm probably going to be more friendly to the distinction between chronologies and narratives than you, although I sort of like, I think your point is well taken about them being co-created and not sort of certainly not created in the sense of like we come up with a chronology first and then later on we kind of fill in the explanatory links between different things that we've chronologized. Like that's clearly not the way that things happen. But I would want to say that in the context of research into like the End-Permian extinction or or like the Cambrian radiation, there is a sense in which work on chronology is really important and separate from more narrative kinds of work. And I think this really comes through when you look at sort of attempts to build stratigraphies out. I mean, those are typically done by stratigraphers, not necessarily by the people who are going to be doing the explanation ultimately. And they're also not using a lot of the same kinds of fighting. The same.
That cat just they hate to talk about stratigraphy. She's
probably out of food. So I might need to lock her out of the room so I don't get mauled by my cat. So like these researchers in these specialist areas, I think sometimes can be seen as building out something like a chronology, something like a temporal framework that is, in a sense, separate from the kinds of narratives that you would overlay once you have that framework in place. But again, having said that, I think that work on stratigraphies and work on sort of like the narrative events that are being illuminated by the stratigraphy often happen in tandem, often are entangled in complicated ways where we're trying to revisit the stratigraphy because we realize that like areas of the narrative need to be firmed up, or we just don't know what was happening at this point, especially fuzzy, something like that. So I would want to hold out for kind of like a kitty. All right, sorry, I gotta get my cat out of here.
We'll just have a short pause for feeding feline purposes, which I'm sure we can. I would lock him out. We'll have a break at about 20 minutes, at which point you can go and see.
Yeah.
So continue.
Yeah, I've never had to talk to people on Zoom before I was getting attacked by an animal. All right, so that was part of your question. What was the other part? Can you?
Well, actually, I think that was I think that was. Well, I mean, I guess one of the I'm happy to sort of go on from there. So because there's a whole bunch of really cool things in there. Because I was thinking as you were talking that I think there's at least two important things going on here, and one is the sort of research context that we have in mind when we're thinking about these things, right? So in the philosophy of history, I'm thinking about an historian going into an archive. And whereas what you're talking about is something which is much more structured at a community level.
Interdisciplinary, yeah.
Yeah. So you have sort of roughly you've got the stamp collectors and that they go out and they collect the stamps. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. And then you have people who are doing sort of slightly other things. And I guess one thing that's kind of interesting is it could be that how plausible or maybe how useful that sort of those description versus explanation or whatever questions might just turn on various things about how the inquiry itself is structured. And that's, I think, kind of an interesting sort of hypothesis as to, that's what I would start thinking if I was trying to tell when this is going to be useful. But a kind of further thing from that is the way I was sort of thinking of it was, so on your picture, which I think is exactly right, what you're getting from the sort of phenomena characterization level are like constraints on adequacy, more or less. So it's kind of saying, if you're going to be a good explanation, you got to hit these things. And I was thinking, well, there's got to be arrows going the other way as well, right? So you're really emphasizing this kind of travel from the phenomenon to explanatory constraints. And I think the explanation's got to be doing some work in terms of significance or something like that, right? Our kind of explanatory interests are sort of telling us what to care about. And that, I think, is kind of interesting, like it's playing this sort of role in pursuit. And I was wondering, I'd like to hear more about the sort of stratigraphers, right? Because my sort of immediate reaction to the distinction is something like, hang on, why are they looking at that area of strata? They're looking at that area of strata because they may not have an explicit hypothesis they want to test in the explanatory case, right? But you don't have to say something as strong as, so in the paper you say something like, correctly, look, it's implausible to say that a stratigrapher in many cases is testing an explanatory hypothesis. I think it's absolutely right. But to say that there's strong influence from this sort of explanatory downwards, if you want, to the characterization game, I don't need to say anything like as strong as these are these hypotheses that are being tested. Rather, there's something like there's some cool stuff we reckon that will pertain to this thing we think is important for explanatory purposes if we look in this place, right? If you think about the way that, grant applications go, I mean, not that this is a good way of tracking what scientists in fact are doing, but regardless, there's this sort of, oh, here's a great big question. If we look here, we'll get some insight into that big question, right? And that's a case in which it's our explanatory interests which are shaping and testing those explanatory hypotheses, which are shaping what phenomena characterization we do. And that seems like a really powerful sort of, as it were, downward kind of constraint.
Yeah, totally. And that's I think really visible in the scientific practice, that that kind of selectivity is coming from, if not an interest in particular explanatory hypotheses, at least a sort of sense that the explanatory action is at this particular part, at this particular juncture in the stratigraphic column or something like that. Like, we need to improve our understanding of this part of the stratigraphy in order to be able to understand the shape of the phenomenon better, because understanding the shape of the phenomenon better is going to give us clues into what caused it, or something else that we're interested in down the line. So there is that, like, really that sort of mutual arrows going both ways kind of directionality. I think I emphasize the sort of more bottom up, the more phenomenon to the supplying constraints and resources for causal modeling, because I saw the other side kind of has its advocates already, right? It's like pretty apparent in some of the stuff that you've written about the role of narratives and storytelling, and speculation, providing scaffolds for different kinds of research. And I sort of wanted to provide the counter narrative to that, but without, I hope it didn't come across as sort of denying the relevance of that stuff, because that would be a silly thing to do. It's very clearly the case that the arrows are running in both directions.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much a sort of yes and kind of discussion, but I take it it's not necessarily a yes and kind of, because often those discussions are kind of boring, right? Where if you're a trained philosopher, you're going and looking for the points of argumentative tension. And so it can be kind of annoying when everyone agrees and says slightly different things. So I guess, so there's one way of trying to get the argumentative tension is to, do a version of, sort of Hempel's response to narratives is to say, oh, they're just explanation sketches. I can imagine for instance, I can imagine Carol Cleland saying something like, but ultimately, all of that stuff is in the service of testing these explanatory hypotheses. Sure, it's not exactly fitting this kind of, this sort of structure I have, but ultimately the reason why we care about those things is in order to explain the patterns of traces we see by positing events in the past. That's the ultimate purpose of it. Like, I'm wondering, like, how do you want to respond to that sort of more aggressive question?
Yeah, so I think it depends on who we are, right? Like, if ultimately the thing that we're interested in depends in part on the kinds of presuppositions and disciplinary backgrounds that we bring to the table. And I don't think that it's necessarily the case that the reason why stratigraphers do their stratigraphy is to get to the explanatory account. I think it's relevant. I also don't think that it's easy to generalize about the ultimate purpose of scientific projects that are being engaged in by a dozen different interdisciplinary communities simultaneously. Like, I sort of think, like, the null hypothesis should be that there isn't an overarching aim shared by all of those communities. And if there is, how are you going to show that is in fact somehow the ultimate aim? Like, it seems very much like there are things that we're interested in as philosophers looking at these historical episodes or these, areas of scientific practice. And I think it's fairly easy and tempting in a lot of cases to kind of project onto these communities what we're interested in out of them. And I just think that it's often more complicated than that. And I also think that there's a kind of imperative for us as practice-based philosophers of science to present reconstructions of the science that if you were to present them to the scientists that were engaged in this work, they would be able to recognize themselves in it and recognize kind of their short-term and long-term aims in that work. And I don't think that you can do that with the presupposition that it's ultimately all about providing these explanatory accounts. I think that's going to cause people to balk at that. And I think that matters. I don't know how you would convince Carol Cleland of that. Like I think that there's some, some of the dull thud of conflicting intuitions here about how you should approach these case studies. But at least for me, that's how I think about what I'm doing.
Yeah, so I'm really delighted that the conversation, I was going to lead the conversation somewhere around here anyway, because one thing that I think is really interesting is that we definitely, one way in which our approaches are really different is to do with how we treat kind of scientific communities and disciplines and things like this. So it might be perhaps I sit somewhere in between you and Carol, right? Where Carol tends to work in a very sort of normative kind of frame, at least with her historical science work, not necessarily true with other stuff she does. I tend to be abstracting to an extent from individual researchers and actual institutional structures, right? So something that has been pointed out to me several times about sort of this sort of notion of methodological omnivory. It's like, wait, do you think that one paleontologist is doing all this? And it's like, no, I'm talking about like a group of them in some fluffy sense, right? I'm kind of abstracting from what you might think of as actual disciplinary divides.
I think I really like that in my review of your book.
I really liked that, yeah, and I liked in the review and also in this paper, there's a bit where you sort of have a little aside about how there's the bit where you say like, but it's not paleontology, there's the stratigraphers, damn it. And I think there's something interesting here where, it puts pressure on me to sort of be like, well, why do I think that that's a good level of analysis? Why do I think that it's okay to kind of abstract from those kind of institutional sort of things, while at the same time, I agree that, of course, those institutional things deeply shape the way that kind of work happens. And I think there might be a case where it's like you're just, in a sense, a lot more practice orientated and perhaps less normative, which doesn't mean that it's not normative, obviously, than I am. And I think this makes it so maybe this is a way of me asking, like, maybe you could give an account of what you think is so important as a philosopher, right? About attending to, it really matters that this person's a stratigrapher, and it really matters that this person is a paleobiologist, even though the way Adrian's going to describe it is a bunch of scientists like found out some stuff about the strata, and then they had this hypothesis about it, and then here's how this hypothesis went, right? So I can describe the dynamics of how that explanation changes, and in fact do, without going, by the way, these people were geochronologists and these people were, whereas the way you describe it, suddenly that detail is in there. And so maybe to speak to the sort of work that you think that stuff's doing, and if you want, say why I'm just making a big mistake.
Well, I don't know about that. I can never figure out how to be normative, like properly normative, like in the way that philosophers are supposed to be. I just don't, I don't know. It's not my inclination to do that. I'm always afraid that I don't know enough and that I'm going to make a fool of myself if I try to sort of lay down the law and say how things are supposed to be. And I'm just sort of constantly suspicious of oversimplifying things to the point where I feel guilty about being in philosophy. I often think like I should have done history or something like that. Like I read history of science and I'm like, that's more like the level of detail that I like. And I just am not there and it makes me uncomfortable. So it's nice that HPS exists. That's what I'm trying to say. I think that for me, yeah. So I have a kind of, I don't know if it's like a phobia or an allergy or something to being normative. Which is rooted in like insecurities, disciplinary insecurities, and worries about not knowing enough about the science. But I also I like sort of mucking around in complexity, and I sort of think that there's different ways that you can do philosophy, different things that you can do, even if you're doing practice-based philosophy of historical sciences or paleontology, which is already niche as fuck, right? Like it's tiny. There's different things you can do in that space. And some of them are more normative, they're more abstract, right? They're more oriented towards sort of epistemological concerns. Like I see your book as being kind of an epistemological project in a lot of ways. Then there are other ways where, like sort of the way that I've always thought of my philosophical work is I'm trying to kind of dissect complexity in a helpful way and certainly analyze complexity without kind of explaining it away, which means that I tend to write kind of long discursive things like this, and to to come down not necessarily in favor of a sort of hard normative conclusion, but to try to sort of introduce hopefully helpful nuances and things that that if I'm doing it right, people will go, oh yeah, like I hadn't seen things that way. That's helpful. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm just saying in more words than I probably needed to, that I think of myself more as doing HPS type projects, and I have inherited some of the historical allergy to doing too much normative work. I guess the only other thing to say is about that is that I'm been interested in descriptive work, characterizational work. I like that kind of work, research, and I kind of like that kind of philosophy too. I think one of the things that we do well as philosophers often is provide good characterizations of scientific work, things that can cut through some of those complexities and frame things in useful categories. I'm not always convinced that our normative work goes as well. Like when I tend to think that people go really wrong, it's usually because they took a strong normative stand. I'm like, oh, like I don't know about that. But I think we do characterizational work pretty well. So, for example, in the case of the Permian extinction, I thought, well, this is just such interesting research. There's so many sort of complex things going on here that are interweaving in different ways, and I can tease that apart. And that's a paper for me. That without the sort of big upshot that epistemologist or someone else might look for.
I think there's a bunch of big upshots that are actually kind of within there that we've already sort of brought out, right? Like this is one of the things that I really like about what I find so valuable in good HPS work is that even though there's a kind of, as you say, almost a sort of quietism about showing your sort of normative face, this paper is very firmly saying, hey, there's a project that no one's doing, which is understanding the dynamics of explanation. Insofar as Adrian's tried to do it, he did it wrong, even though he's right about some things, I guess. And further, this near obsession that philosophers have with explanations and testing hypotheses, where by hypotheses they mean explanatory hypotheses, is something which is leading them to just completely miss like a lot of the work that's kind of going on. And you can use that to sort of talk about this is why philosophers never talk about field work. This is why, philosophers, we sort of grow up when you do philosophy undergraduate and you do philosophy of science, they're like, it's about theories and explanations. And try as you might, I always find myself back in those sorts of areas. And it's really difficult for me to not accidentally frame things in terms of this. So I think as a kind of corrective, and as a kind of, here's a bunch of new directions, the paper's actually, quite powerful, which I sort of, but as you say, like, I don't know if you could write the paper more aggressively. It probably wouldn't work as well. And nor might you want to.
I felt a little, this is why I sent Adrian this paper, I should say, before I submitted it, because I didn't know if I was being charitable or not. I thought I was. I was like, I'm going to try to present this in a really good light. But I also felt like I was not misreading you, but like deliberately reading you in a very strict and narrow way. Like I was really holding you to exactly what you said in a way that if someone did that to me, I'd be like, come on, man, yeah. But I was doing it for a reason, which is that I wanted to make these points. And you provided a kind of useful foil as someone who was, like a sort of high profile person in this area who was kind of presenting this sort of view that I wanted to push back on. So anyways, I wasn't sure when I was writing this, and this is more like maybe a point about like professional courtesy. I wasn't sure whether I was reading you in a way that was irritating or not.
Yeah.
Or that was going to be like, like really, really granular or something like that. So I appreciate that you're not upset.
Well, it's a really good sort of question, right? So one of the things that you find as people start, responding to and reading your work is often there's the two things I often think about this. One is I firmly subscribe to the death of the philosopher in the same sense as the death of the author. I think that just because I happen to write the work, that doesn't mean I have any special authority over what it means, because it's just throwing your weight around otherwise. But the second thing is also people don't have the same agenda as I do in that paper. And people will, typically when you're a philosopher, philosophers are extremely egotistical. We want to say the thing that we want to say, and we only care about things if they help us say that. And so, of course, we, by and large, pick out the bit of the person's view that's going to help us say the thing we want to say, damn it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. We just have to kind of realize it and both be kind of insofar, sometimes there are places where I'm just misread and I'm like, that's not really what I say. There's like laziness, and then there's being used as a foil. And I think there's an extent to which there are ways you can use people as foils where and I think you do it very well, right? You don't, you're sort of kind of careful with how you talk about the work. I'll often just sort of signal, I'm more or less using this person as a foil. Their view's more sophisticated, but whatever. You can say things like that. And so it's kind of, I guess another thing to say is that from the perspective, the reason you do philosophy is you want people to engage with you and actually take your work seriously. And it happens ridiculously rarely, right? And so, that someone's even talking about it from the perspective of, you as a philosopher is this like amazing, wonderful thing, right? So, the idea that I would be upset by anything in the paper is very funny. But something that I'm upset about in the paper is and it's something that I think is really interesting, and I think as we mentioned on Tuesday, is so there's the way that you talk about sort of simplicity and complexity really seem to be focused on the kind of triggers. So there's this kind of thing. It's like so the only reason I can tell that the original Pangea hypothesis was more or less for you as simple as the later consensus hypothesis is because both of them have one trigger, right? One is the Pangea coming together and the other one is the volcanoes. But actually, the account that I have doesn't say anything about number of triggers, right? Technically speaking, at least the only one I bothered to go back and look at was the 2019. It doesn't come off like that. I'm not talking about that. But of course, I call them one-shot hypotheses. And so, of course, what that means is there's one trigger, damn it. And so one is like, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm not reading my own work properly, but my sense was there's actually a mischaracterization there. But it's a mischaracterization that you're going to get when you use a metaphor like one-shot hypothesis. So I wonder, do you get the sense that maybe I'm right, that at least in terms of the machinery, those two things are one, the later consensus one is actually more complex than the original one, quite significantly so. But then the second point is it looks like the one-shot hypothesis metaphor is outrunning the machinery I'm using.
Yeah, so the simplicity complexity thing, I do obviously a lot of hand waving about because I don't have any kind of principled way of understanding those other than you can kind of map out the causal geometry between different factors, and the more arborescent looking causal trees are sort of intuitively more complex. I think I would agree that there's a sense in which the most recent consensus hypothesis, which is, by the way, no longer a consensus hypothesis,
of course not.
Is more complex than the Pangea hypothesis. But I also think that they're both sort of noticeably less complex than the Irwin hypothesis. And it doesn't just have to do with triggers. So it has to do with the sort of early continental drift hypothesis and the later runaway greenhouse hypothesis both have more or less a single trigger that gets modulated in different ways. But then there's a number of different downstream kill mechanisms that are in the train of that triggering cause. And they're broadly comparable between the two. The kill mechanisms aren't spelled out as explicitly in the earlier work, in part because just like in that era of paleontological work on mass extinction, nothing was spelled out as explicitly, right? It was just different. So many less people working on it with a different sort of not even really characterizing it as mass extinction necessarily. I mean, they understood what we would call mass extinction, but it wasn't being framed in terms of some of the same conceptual categories and understandings that we have now. less actualistic studies of sort of how these kill mechanisms work, blah, 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 all that stuff, right? So the sense in which I think the contemporary hypothesis is more complicated is it's much better fleshed out, it's much more realized. But I think there's kind of a basic skeleton to it that's not so much more complex than the basic skeleton of the Pangea hypothesis, sort of single trigger and several downstream kill mechanisms, ramifying effects, as opposed to what Irwin talks about in '93 and sort of papers around that time, which is rather complex, right? Like there's all kinds of things going on, and it seems like it's somewhere Doug Irwin says people used to call it his kitchen sink hypothesis, which is like very apropos, I think, in terms of description of it. Okay, so that's one thing. Your view of one-shot hypotheses, maybe I was uncharitable in that respect. I when I read it, and it's been a long time since I looked at that paper, what I remember was I thought that there was a kind of ambiguity in it between talking about one-shot hypotheses in terms of the one-shot being a kind of trigger, or the one-shot being kind of like a sufficient cause to produce some effect. So insofar as one-shot hypotheses are simple, which I think you say in the paper, it would imply that you kind of have the latter notion in mind. There's like, a cause that's adequate to produce an effect, vera causa stuff here, something like that. A trigger can have all kinds of downstream kind of subsidiary mechanisms, which can make it rather complex, right? So like in the case of the greenhouse, runaway greenhouse scenario for the End-Permian, it's a rather complicated causal model. But I think calling it a one-shot model is not necessarily wrong. Like the shot is hundreds of thousands of years of trap eruptions and slow volcanism and things like that, but it's still, distinguishable as a single causal factor. So I think what I wanted to pick on in this part of the paper was some ambiguities, either in what you said or in a way that I think it's easy to read you. Maybe that's the disagreement. I'm not sure whether it's something that you said and I mischaracterized it, or just like a way that you're going to probably be read. But at any rate, that was the idea.
No, that's really helpful, because it was something that because I had to go back, because I had to go back and sort of look at what did I actually say there, because I couldn't remember whether I was talking about triggers or not. But I think there's a lot more. Like one thing to say is, of course, and this picks out the difference between one way in which I'm definitely more normative than you, is that I, of course, defined them as being simple, right? So by definition, they're simple. And so you can't say that there's a complex one-shot hypothesis, because it's not a one-shot hypothesis, because it's not simple.
Okay, yeah.
Which is an extremely boring disagreement, right? Because I win by definitional fiat. But I think a more interesting discussion you might build out of that then is, what is it about Irwin's sort of hypothesis in the 90s that makes it one that annoyed the paleontologists so much, and two, seems to be so different. And so there's these sort of perfect storm style explanations, these explanations for phenomena where you have these multiply apparently independent causes kind of doing business at the same time. You might think that, hey, we're talking about an enormous period of time. This is a really rare event, so I should anticipate kind of these sorts of, perfect stormy things to happen. Yet it seems like paleontologists work pretty hard to go to those as like a last resort or something like that. They seem to prefer the ones where you have the particular trigger. And for me, there's a really interesting question as to why they might have that kind of preference. And you might think, oh, maybe in the back of their minds, there's often a sort of common cause kind of reasoning going on. And so, that's one sort of story you might have as to why that preference is there, if indeed it is, And so I think there's some really interesting stuff to say about, maybe at least sometimes paleontologists are very, very happy with complexity, but they want that complexity to involve a trigger. And they do spend a lot of time trying to find and arguing about triggers, which is kind of weird if you think the world is, I guess I don't find the Irwin hype. I mean, maybe it turns out to be false, but I don't find it to be unattractive on its face. In fact, I quite like it.
Yeah, it's definitely wrong, which even Doug will say. But I think I don't know if it's that mysterious why people didn't like it. So in one of Doug's books, he says something like scientists don't care about, and in Doug Irwin's very provocative style, right? Says scientists don't care about the truth; they care about being right. And what that means is that they care about being able to test these ideas and show them to be right. So here, hypothesis testing is relevant, right? So the idea is that you have a kitchen sink hypothesis. It might be the most adequate in terms of explaining all the evidence, but that's not what people are picking up on. They're picking up on people being frustrated with him for similar reasons, that he has these sort of brilliant ideas, but then doesn't test them, and it's not always clear how to test them. So I think just different values there, right? Doug is seeing like, this is this really complex thing. I need to figure out how to explain it. And if the model's complex, so what, right? And like kind of like what Kim Strelmy says in some stuff about human evolution, right? Like, it's complicated, too bad, like the world's complicated. And then other folks are just like, well, actually, like, that's not helpful, right? Because that's not what we're doing here. We're trying to come up with testable ideas that can give us empirical traction on this, and you're not giving us anything really to work with, which I think is actually uncharitable. I mean, Irwin's hypothesis was found wanting. So in some sense, it was, tested by a community of people. It just wasn't tested in the kind of, the sort of lifespan of a grant application or something that people would want when you put it out there. You can't go in 1993 out to a set of outcrops and figure out whether it's right or wrong. It just, just takes a while. Yeah, sorry. I think I got lost a bit in that.
Yeah, no, that was great. Like, yeah, I mean, that was music to my ears. I think sort of as as opposed to me now making you talk about speculation for half an hour, we should take a sort of 5-minute break and then come back for other people to sort of start asking questions. So just to sort of as a sort of primer, like a lot of the, I'm actually pretty interested in hearing like, the mixture here is mostly philosophy and archaeology, more or less. And I think it'd be quite interesting to have the archaeologists tell us a little bit about how we've talked a lot about scientists' aims and scientists' values and what they take themselves to be doing when they're doing their science. It might be really interesting to hear what people from various disciplines think about that as they do it. And also the sort of disciplinary stuff. We're really interested to hear some of that. But generally, we'll take a 5-minute break, then we'll come back and start throwing questions at Max. So see you soon.
Can I plug something as long as no one's asking a question right now?
Yeah.
So I have a new paper with Alan Love and the BJPS, which is very similar in some ways to this paper. It has a very long case study in the middle about the Cambrian radiation. And so the title of the paper is The Interdisciplinary Entanglement of Characterization and Explanation, which tells you a lot about what the paper's about, especially if you've read this. And it's sort of situated in the growing philosophical literature on the characterization of phenomena, where we try to say something like, these studies have been largely conducted in the context of thinking about mechanistic discovery and explanation, and as a result, the picture of characterization that you get is somewhat tailored to these rather simple phenomena. And if you look at complicated things like the Cambrian explosion, like all of a sudden you see all these different features. But some of the bidirectional traffic between characterization and explanation, stuff like that, comes through in that paper. So if you haven't had enough after this 15,000 word behemoth of a paper, there's more where that came from. So that's impressive.
Yeah, maybe I want to say something, put something sort of, say something kind of provocative. I'm increasingly like uncomfortable with terms like disciplinary and interdisciplinary. I increasingly think that like when we talk about disciplines, what is a discipline and what is it to be interdisciplinary? I'm kind of increasingly find myself thinking things like, oh, well, these are categories that are used by university institutions and other institutions to control and structure scientific work in ways which often isn't very helpful.
Yeah, totally. No, I completely agree. The disciplinary structure is in some ways a relic, and interdisciplinary research is kind of the rule now, right? Which just means purely descriptively that people get paychecks from different disciplines. But I think one of the interesting things about some of this literature, again, and this sort of parallels points that I made in the End-Permian paper, is that you know, a lot of philosophical work is kind of situated in a disciplinary context. You know, I'm interested in, you know, neuroscience or whatever, you know, set aside that those are themselves kind of disciplinary kludges, right? But there's sort of more richly interdisciplinary areas of research, like these big geohistorical projects that I think have some different features, right? In particular, like different patterns of division of labor that are relevant to keep track of. And the fact that we don't sometimes look or think of ourselves as doing, you know, philosophy of interdisciplinary work can lead us away from some of those, because, you know, I'm just interested in what the neuroscientists do, or I'm just interested in what the evolutionary biologists do, or whatever. Right. So I think the label is useful in a certain way, although I totally agree with you that sort of the notion of interdisciplinarity is inherently a bit fuzzy and problematic.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that there's a whole bunch to say about what's sort of difficult or annoying about this, but I mean, part of it is, yeah. So if someone were to say to me, you know, I'm doing interdisciplinary paleontology, I'd be like, well, so you're doing paleontology then? Like, I'm just like, what? Like these sciences are kind of very inherently sort of involve these sort of, you know, quite wide variety of sort of different types of tools.
Oh yeah, paleontology is one of the most inherently hybrid of disciplines, right? Because you're gonna be doing, well, at least like if you're a more biologically oriented paleontologist, you're going to be doing a lot of biology. You might be working with phylogenies. You might be doing functional morphology. You might be doing evolution type stuff. And you might at the same time be doing like stratigraphy and soft rock geology, and, or, you know, like thinking about, you know, biogeochemistry, or all sort of like pulling from very much earth science type traditions and approaches. And people have actually cultivated both of these skill sets, right, that are getting paid as paleobiologists or whatever. And that's just inherently not just interdisciplinary, like giant, traditionally separated domains of science, you know, in a single person in some cases.
And I guess it's also because you think about the sort of frameworks that you use and that and I use as well, and also sort of sociologists of science use. So if you have, like, you know, things like, I really like the problem agenda sort of framework, and you know, we've talked about a few others, you know, that sociologists have used in this course before. And what's interesting about those is that they don't obey these disciplinary boundaries, right? And I kind of feel as if those categories are so much more useful in sort of trying to understand how scientific work goes. And then you have to appeal to disciplinary boundaries where you're explaining why things don't work quite often. It's like, oh, well, one of the things that's going on here is that because these two people are from these two different disciplines, they talk in these different ways, and that's created this problem. And so I think it's kind of, so I guess the worry I have about using terms like interdisciplinary is that I find terms like, like I'm talking in terms of a research agenda, you know, so much more useful. And I take it, so I guess there's sort of a question then about, like, what are the contexts in which you want to use the word interdisciplinary, and why would you, sort of? And we're speaking pragmatically here, right?
Yeah. So is that a question for me to answer?
Yeah.
So the reason why Alan and I used it was to highlight that the kind of entanglement of characterization and explanation that we had in view was typically taking place between researchers in different communities. And I don't care if they're disciplinary communities or not. In some sense they are. But one of the things that you can say about some philosophical work that's been done on characterization is, so for example, in the mechanistic discovery literature, you often get accounts where, you know, recharacterization matters. It's a relevant process. It happens in response to certain kinds of explanatory failures, say. But the picture that you get in mind there is like you've got a group of people working in a lab, so like a lab group, right? And they're engaged in, you know, discovering features of this phenomenon and characterizing it for the purpose of discovering the mechanism, right? And when they run into roadblocks in the process of articulating a mechanism, sends them back to the characterization board, so to speak, and then they do their recharacterization work and then get on with it. So there's this sort of tight loop that's taking place in a very narrow kind of investigative context. Whereas I think in cases like the Permian extinction or the Cambrian radiation, what you have is kind of recharacterization happening all the time, and these sort of looping effects between characterization and explanation taking place on much bigger scales, you know, including including ones that sort of transgress traditional disciplinary boundaries. So to just highlight that that's the kind of scale that we're working at and talking about, sort of a large scale interweaving of characterization and explanation, we use the word interdisciplinary, but without, I don't think without really saying anything about interdisciplinarity as such, just as a way of flagging that that's what we're doing.
Yeah, no, it's a way of sort of signaling what you're doing. Yeah, totally buy that. Let's go to Denise.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so hi, sorry, my camera is off, patchy internet. Hopefully everything comes through okay. So thank you, Max and Adrian, hosting this. This is great. I also wanted to give a bit of context. I'm a philosopher of biology out of UC Davis, and I have recently discovered that I am in fact also doing some philosophy of the historical sciences courses. Yay! So I'm like, oh, I'm in this club, so cool. So yeah, I'm super interested in the discussion that's happening here, and based on some of the things Adrian talked about on Tuesday. I have questions there, but I did want to actually pick up a little bit on this question about disciplinarity, and maybe I can tie it into my earlier question. So on the simplicity complexity issue, I wanted to see first if I sort of have this general trajectory. I'm correct in distinguishing the different positions you each have forward. Sort of something like the idea is that, especially mainly from the 2014 paper of Adrian's, it's the idea that things go from simple to complex, and that Max, you're coming in and going, well, there's this missed space here to discuss where things go simple, complex, back to simple. So that's sort of wanting to sort of discuss how there can be that dynamic and where and when that happens. I was actually thinking to myself in relation to the question of when we're talking about, not in terms of disciplines, but in terms of sort of individuals or research communities. I sometimes wonder if the simplicity complexity distinction can help us actually pick out who is perceiving their work in relation to some hypotheses or some explanation as playing a particularly simple or complex role. And so if maybe some of the work here is thinking about how non-explanatory, and again, I guess this is another embedded question in what I'm talking about here, if non-explanatory work has in it what is perceived to be overlooked features of simplicity in the historical sciences. So I don't know if I've made any sense. If you would like me to explain more on any of those points, please do, because I think I've tried to pack too much into a single comment question thread.
So I might ask a follow up on the last part, but I can talk to the first part first. First of all, hi Denise.
Okay.
Nice.
Hi.
Or just to hear you. Yeah. So this is another area where I might have been uncharitably reading Adrian. So Adrian made a nice comment, or made a nice observation starting in that 2014 paper, and then picking up on it again in the one-shot paper, which is that certain philosophical views at least might lead you to think that that explanations have a tendency to become more unifying over time or something like that, more simple in some sense. But in fact, in the historical sciences, we see a pretty consistent trajectory towards complexification over time. And I think that's absolutely right. That's like this annoying thing that happens in this sort of geohistorical work. Things start off looking really simple and neat and tidy and fitting into patterns, and then of course, like things just continually mess that up, and things get a lot more complicated. Part of the reason that I wanted to write this paper is that there are these rare exceptions where that pattern doesn't necessarily obtain, at least in kind of linear way. And I think it's important I think it kind of gives us insight into some of the drivers of this complexifying pattern to look at cases where it doesn't obtain, right? So and look where things are going wrong, so to speak, in the in the trend towards complexity to figure out what exactly is driving that. So that was more like a methodological thing on my part, where I thought that I could get something out of that. I could make a more compelling case that I've laid hold of significant driving factors, if those can also help me account for these anomalies in the pattern, right? And the pattern, I agree, like generally obtains. So I hope that speaks to the part of the sort of the first part of that comment. Could you say a bit more about the second part, about the sort of assumptions on the part of the non-explanatory, would-be non-explanatory folks about simplicity and complexity?
Yeah, so I guess my question is, one, is there kind of, let me see if I can formulate this question differently. Is there a perspective, because I'm genuinely unsure, is there a perspective that non-explanatory work produces simpler explanations, or is it that it's a simpler collection of data or evidence that can be used as a sort of a tool towards complexification? Like, so I'm trying to sort of think here, and I was thinking in this in particular, Adrian said, was talking
your internet
about,
gotcha.
Oh no, sorry. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you now, yeah.
Okay, so Adrian was discussing sort of simple narratives, and he mentioned this this sort of embeddedness in a model, and this sort of parasitic feature. And I'm still trying to understand that, so maybe Adrian can also speak to this too. I'm sort of thinking of like, is part of your methodological push here to try to unpack places where simplicity is being passed off as complexity, and how do we characterize, is it that non-explanatory work is just, in virtue of being non-explanatory or descriptive, just naturally considered more simplistic? So yeah, I'm trying to understand if just in virtue of it being descriptive, it's assumed that it's going to be more simplistic than an explanatory work. So
I don't know if I'm comfortable applying the categories of simplicity and complexity to the work itself.
Okay.
What I think I would want to say is that people who are engaged in non-explanatory work are engaged in characterization. They're trying to figure out, in some sense, what the past was like. They're trying to understand the contours of an event, say, as opposed to figuring out what caused that event. So it could, that could mean, in the case of an extinction, what is the rate at which it happened? What are the relevant patterns of, taxonomic selectivity? How does it align with other kinds of events? People who are engaged in that work are typically pretty well aware that in the current state of research, wherever you are, there are areas that are more or less fuzzy, right? So if you're thinking back to like the 1950s and 60s and 70s, when sort of interest in big extinction events was starting to pick up some steam, because of the way that stratigraphy was done at that point, and because of limitations in geochronometric dating and the inability to correlate a lot of important sections, or to even sort of place them reliably in a global stratigraphy, it's like you're looking at the extinction through a microscope that isn't really focused entirely, right? So you can kind of see it, like what's going on, and so the work is, in some sense, an attempt to bring this into focus, right? It's not going to be brought into focus by any one party. It's going to be a lot of people working on different aspects of it, but sort of the idea is gradually, interdisciplinarily, whatever, you end up with a clear image of what you're looking at. And in a lot of cases, that's going to reveal detail that you didn't know was there originally, in the same way that being able to get a higher resolution when you're looking through a microscope is going to reveal all kinds of things where it's like, oh, I just didn't know that was there. And once it's there, then in some cases, at least, it's going to be relevant to explain this stuff. So I think I used the example of the gigantic perturbation in the carbon cycle around the Permian extinction. Once you know that that's there, got to account for it. And it's going to inform other things that you think about the Permian extinction too, probably. because that's just a strange behavior of the Earth system, at a very suspicious time. So in that sense, I think that this characterizational work often sort of contributes to complexifying explanations because it's able to focus that microscope more on the features of the event. And I think people engaged in it have a kind of understanding that what they're doing is revealing layers of complexity that weren't apparent at first. But yeah, so maybe that's all I'll say about it then.
Actually, I want to come in a little bit on this actually, because there's something that part of what sort of Denise was sort of talking around as well was this notion of having sort of simpler or more complicated characterizations. And it struck me that Megan Page has managed to convince me that we can sensibly talk about non-explanatory narratives. So she wants to say that maybe the characterization we might have of, the extinction event, it's not explanatory, but it is in some important respect a narrative. And it strikes me that actually there are really interesting ways you might think about differences in those characterizations. So you've been focusing on resolution, so how focused it is. Another one might be something like simplicity or complexity, which you can imagine in terms of like curve fitting or something like that, right? So different ways in which I might, how much of the detail I might have in my data model of the, of this or the reconstruction or something like that. And one thing I think is that historical scientists are really good at picking the right level of idealization in order to be able to do stuff with the data they have. And I think there might be something interesting there, thinking about the ways in which the level, how fine or coarse grained they go with the sort of representation, or how much their curve fitting they do, might really track the kinds of questions they're asking, or what sorts of things they think they're going to be able to do with that. So it might be this really interesting notion of simplicity. Maybe simplicity and complexity is the wrong terms for it, but in terms of those trajectories or those patterns that they're trying to bring out.
Does Megan Page have a paper on the non-explanatory?
She's working on it, and I've told her to talk to you.
Yeah, so I agree with that. I agree with that point, if I understand it right, in part because I think whether something is explanatory is going to depend on certain pragmatic factors. So narratives, the explanatory value hinges on whether or not you care about how you get from here to here. Say if that's what you're interested in, you got an explanation. If it's not, you might just have something else. But I shouldn't be talking right now.
Let's move on to the big room.
So you mentioned at one point the way that you approach the subject in a kind of a non-normative way and sort of the HPS style, and that was very interesting to me. So, and you sort of provided your almost sort of personal reasons why you would approach the subject like that. But my question is whether do you think there are any deeper reasons why HPS sort of approach might be the right approach, or maybe not the right approach, but sort of preferential approach in historical sciences and sciences like paleontology? One reason that sort of comes to mind, at least to me, is that these sciences are pretty young sciences, actually, and the rate of sort of change of theories and hypotheses and evidence is phenomenal compared to, say, physics, which is, especially some areas of physics, which have been around as sort of fairly well-established methodological inquiries for like hundreds of years, and theories don't really, you need to wait for like 50 years for a new experiment. So it's kind of understandable that philosophers look at them synchronically, right? Not in the HPS sort of a manner, but rather sort of, evidence and hypothesis or theory, and sort of look at some conceptual details and puzzles. Whereas here it seems to me that dynamics of knowledge is much more sort of in the focus. But on the other hand, is that really, are we losing the sight of the kinds of questions that sort of logical positivists or their offspring might have in mind when these sciences are concerned? So anyways, do you have any sort of a story or thoughts about the HPS methodology of approaching the historical sciences?
So I thank you for the question. I like, so in Adrian's book, he says in the introduction or something, you might think it's an irony that I'm approaching the historical sciences from a overtly non-historical standpoint. And I don't think it is. I mean, it's like maybe curious or something like that. Maybe you think that people who are interested in historical sciences would like be more inclined to take that approach, but I don't think there's anything inherently preferable about an HPS approach to understanding historical science as opposed to, you know, any other kind of science. I do think that, you know, different strokes for different folks kind of in this respect. Like I feel like the way that I am as a writer or a scholar is like I definitely think that way of working is sort of more suited to what I'm interested in and what I'm good at. And I think it directs you to certain kinds of questions and maybe will incline you to adopt certain kinds of methodological positions that you might not otherwise adopt. But I don't see any reason to think that those strategies or positions are sort of uniquely calibrated to shining light on the historical sciences. I do think that one thing that is advantageous about taking a historical perspective on the geosciences, at least, is that there is a very good and very, I think, philosophically interesting and sophisticated historiography of these sciences, which is, you know, in large part due to folks like Martin Rudwick and David Oldroyd, and there's like really good histories of geology. David Sikowski more recently, and I've sort of been very fortunate to engage with some of those people, and I feel like I benefited a lot from their work. So I don't know to what extent this is unique. I you know, there's good historians working on lots of areas of the sciences, but I think that in this area at least there's lots of there's sort of a really rich and philosophically suggestive secondary historical literature, which has been underutilized, which is good for me, I guess. But that's really the only thing that I can think of off the top of my head as to why that approach might be, you know, especially advantageous in this area.
Yeah, so just one sort of follow-up, maybe comment. There is kind of a selection effect going on actually in studying sciences historically or kind of less historically, because usually physics, until fairly recently, was portrayed typically as, you know, you have a theory, evidence, experiments, and it's like a sort of a linear line of, you know, more or less development of that sort, and it wasn't really portrayed as a string of debates. Whereas now, when you look at the way that people treat historical sciences or even biology of the 20th century, it's kind of tends to be portrayed as a string of debates. I think the selection effect is that we didn't really have documented, as well documented, or even close, documented the actual process and the debates as we have in the 20th century, especially sort of, I don't know, after the Second World War, right? So just because of the extent of publishing and that everything is sort of available and transparent. So I think HPS sort of points that you made really are applicable to science in general, but it's just that, you know, they happened in a different sort of a time frame, and then, you know, the evidence about these debates or sort of development of these disciplines is very different. But anyways, thank you very much for your answer.
Yeah, I mean, it is worth pointing out that, of course, there is a large and thriving HPS of physics. It's not as if people aren't doing this work. But let's go to. I never know whether it's Joe or Joseph.
Joe is great.
Joe.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, hi everybody. Yeah, thanks for the interesting discussion, Max and Adrian and everybody. Yeah, a little background. I'm a philosopher of science. I'm at the University of Colorado Boulder. My dissertation advisor, my thesis advisor was Carol Cleland. So you've heard a lot about Carol Cleland. I've worked with her a lot over the last several years. I have a have a question about sort of the scope of this project, I guess, partly because I think I'm convinced, right, that explanations in historical science start off simple, and they can, or often there's a trend towards complexity. But because, maybe partly because I spend a lot of time thinking about historical climatology. I do work in paleoclimate, but I'm also interested in forward-looking climate science. I think about climate models and complex systems and whatever's going on with those supercomputers. I'm wondering whether this simple to complex trend for explanations, sort of how much can we stretch it to include non-historical sciences? Basically, I'm curious, Max, what you think about, if you've thought about it at all, or if you have any sort of thoughts off the top of your head about how plausible is this story for explanations in general in science, or perhaps, to not lead the witness too much, are there non-historical systems that lend themselves to this sort of pattern of explanation? I mean, have you thought about that?
Yeah, people ask me this a lot. So first, hi Joe, it's good to meet you in person.
Yeah, pleasure.
I've thought about it a bit. I certainly think that, like there are obvious cases where, for example, you look at the history of climate modeling, where you see to what extent you consider this explanatory. I don't know, that's maybe a complicated thing to talk about, but I think vectors of going from simplicity to complexity are sort of ubiquitous in the science, at least the sciences that I'm familiar with. So I would expect this to have a fairly wide scope. The other area that I know quite a bit about is sort of ecology, evolutionary biology. And there you see really sort of discipline-wide trend towards sort of more and more complicated accounts since about the 1960s, where you see lots of very simple theoretical models coming in at first, being used in explanations. And an interesting thing that happens in ecology is you get a big pushback against this because people offer all these sort of simplistic models that can recover really kind of abstract patterns in data, so like diversity area relationships or something like that. And then people go, oh shit, there's no way of adjudicating this. Like all these models can kind of recover the same pattern, but are they really getting at any relevant causal structures? So in the 70s, and especially in the 80s, you get this huge move towards experimentation where people can't even get things published in journals unless they're experimental, and they're going very mechanistic, right? And then they kind of run the same, the different side of that issue where it's like, oh no, like, can we really generalize this stuff now? So you see things like, distributed experiments coming in and meta-analyses that are ways of trying to kind of blend these two approaches together. But what you end up with are these very, very complicated stories, right? Where you have lots of different sort of causal stories about regional differences embedded in highly hedged about and qualified generalizations, and sort of nested kinds of models. And it's really a mess, but it's a really interesting mess. So yeah, I fully expect this kind of thing to have a wide application. And I'm not going to answer for Adrian, but I would think that someone with Adrian's starting point, the world is complicated, would have that position too. Is that right, Adrian?
Yeah. I mean, basically, amusingly, I thought as soon as you started asking the question, Joe, I started thinking about the development of like models and something like community ecology or something like that, where, you go back to the 50s and 60s and people are like, oh, here's a predator-prey model. You look now and there's a group of people who are still going, oh, look, here's a predator-prey model. And then there's everyone else who have these arrows going every which way. So I suppose there is that kind of movement. Seeing as we're sort of just coming up against it, I thought I would just finish by saying, so Max mentioned earlier that he was, wonderfully candid about this sort of confidence, this lack of confidence, and then how much that drives some of his work. I wanted to sort of, Max and I were recently together at a conference in Notre Dame, South Bend, where we hadn't, completely undecided, we ended up using similar case studies. We ended up, talking about the Edge of Karen. And I have to say, nothing is more intimidating than having to describe a bit of science right after Max has already described that science, because of the sort of there's the command of the, so that fear you have of not knowing enough seems to really put you in a good position to know a lot of stuff. And I think I should be more afraid in order to be a better scholar. But I want to really thank you both for coming along and being so generous with your time, and also for writing this paper. Like, as I mentioned earlier, like, it's actually very rare in philosophy that someone actually takes your work seriously. And I sort of, it's meant a lot to me to have that kind of interaction. But yeah, that's all. Thanks, Mac. Thank Max a lot. And we'll be back next week with Joyce Hafstad.
All right. Thank you all. I enjoyed this.
Yeah.